This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is All Our Trials, Prisons, Policing, and the Feminist Fight to End Violence by Emma L. Thawra. During the 1970s, grassroots activists within and beyond the walls of women's prisons forged a radical politics against gender violence and incarceration. Scholar-activist Emily L. Thawra traces the making of this anti-carceral feminism at the intersections of struggles for racial and economic justice, imprisoned and institutionalized people's rights, and gender and sexual liberation. Thawra reveals a violent culture of opposition to interpersonal and state violence that both transforms our understanding of 1970s social movements and illuminates the history of present struggles for transformative justice. Find All Our Trials at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is my interview with Mouin Rabbani on Israel's war on Iran, possible direct U.S. intervention, and the ongoing genocide in Gaza. As we speak, Trump is considering directly intervening to take part in the Israeli assault. Iran's struggle for sovereignty against imperialist powers dates back to the 19th century. Constantly, those imperialist powers have intervened to crush those struggles for sovereignty. Most dramatically with the 1953 UK-US coup against democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. It was a government that had to be overthrown because Iran had dared to commit the crime of nationalizing its own oil. In 1979, the Islamic Revolution overthrew the Shah's brutal U.S.-backed regime, combining Shia religious piety and Third Worldist anti-imperialism, including, from the get-go, an extremely close relationship to the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. Iran, at that moment, stepped into the vacuum created by Egypt's shift into the Western imperialist camp under Anwar Sadat, alongside the more generalized defeat of Arab revolutionary nationalist governments across the region. Eskandar Sadeghi-Boroujerdi writes in New Left Review's Sidecar blog, quote, "Though framed in the deceptive language of preemption or non-proliferation, the Israeli escalation reflects a far more expansive and ambitious agenda, not just halting Iran's nuclear program, but dismantling Iran as a sovereign regional actor capable of resisting U.S.-Israeli domination. This regime change procedure should not come as a surprise to anyone who knows the recent history of the region. Its trail of destruction already traverses Iraq, Libya, Syria, Palestine, and Lebanon. Indeed, we could follow that trail of destruction deeper into Middle East history, where it also traverses Egypt and Jordan. Looking back to 1948 and then 1967, we can see that the U.S. and Israel have systematically sought to dismantle every government in the region that might challenge the Western imperialist power that, in the wake of World War I, seized control, to challenge the West or the Zionist settler colonial entity that those imperialist powers implanted in the heart of the region. Decades ago, Israel was surrounded by revolutionary nationalist governments intent on the liberation of Palestine. Today, those governments have been destroyed. We can also, of course, put today's conjuncture into the context of the post-9/11 forever war, the war on terror, and the destruction of Iraq and Syria, the war on Yemen, and also the war on Afghanistan, which to this day has resulted in millions of Afghan refugees living in Iran. And we can place it, of course, in the context of the long-term settler colonial project to eradicate indigenous presence on the land in Palestine, a project that's murderously accelerated with the present genocide. By the time you're listening to this, breaking news has no doubt changed key facts of the situation. But the basic outline of what's going on is overwhelmingly clear, including when it comes to U.S. domestic politics. Democratic leadership has once again failed to oppose war. Indeed, we've had 2 decades plus of Democratic leadership working with Republicans to launch wars, and since October 2023, to finance and legitimate Israel's genocide. Leaders on the left wing of the party, like Bernie and AOC, have spoken out, and they represent the core of the liberal base as they do so, but not party leadership. And so if Trump does decide against bombing Iran, and I truly hope he does, it'll be thanks to the opposition of far-right isolationists like Tucker Carlson. That's truly sad, rather incredible, and deeply consequential. I'm sincerely hoping that Trump pulls back from direct war with Iran. But we should be absolutely clear that a democratic establishment enthralled to militarism, once again allowing the far right to capture the powerful but inchoate anti-war energies coursing through this country, that this represents an ongoing political disaster. If you want a really deep historical dive on these subjects, 2 suggestions. First, check out Thawra, our 19-part series on the history of Arab politics with Abed Takriti. And then, second, check out our 5-part series on the history of Iran with Eskandar Sadeghi-Boroujerdi and Gulnar Nikpour. That 5-part series on Iran also covers domestic struggles against the Iranian regime and how Western imperialism undermines those efforts to transform Iran from the inside. You can find both those series alongside our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. I've included a link to that and a link to Eskandar's excellent new essay at New Left Review's Sidecar blog in the show notes. And also, a message for Chicago listeners. I'm doing a live show July 2nd at the Lincoln Lodge with In These Times magazine on the state of Chicago politics, appraising Mayor Brandon Johnson's tenure 2 years in. My guests will be Alex Hahn, Asha Ransby-Sporn, and Alderwoman Jeanette Taylor. There's a link for tickets in the show notes. Please come by. Hope to see you there. Say hello. Before we get started, please do support The Dig at patreon.com/thedig. We put everything out with no paywall because we want everyone to listen. This is, first and foremost, a political education project. This model, it works because listeners like you voluntarily contribute. What's more, all contributors get our excellent occasional newsletter. Particularly generous contributors get special gifts. But the real reason to contribute is that your contribution makes this all possible. And just so you know, every contribution results in an email sent to me with your name on it. And each and every time, it makes me smile. So there's that too. Okay, patreon.com/thedig. Please take a moment to contribute. There's a link in the show notes. Okay, here's Mouin Rabbani, a co-editor of Jadaliyah and non-resident senior fellow of the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Mouin Rabbani, welcome to The Dig.
It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for inviting me.
I can't think of another country that's launched military strikes on so many neighbors in such a short amount of time in recent history. Indeed, maybe we have to go all the way back to apartheid South Africa, which attacked Botswana, Zambia, and Zimbabwe in 1986 to find any sort of parallel, or perhaps to Israel's own wars throughout those decades. Is Israel's war on Iran a war to protect the genocide in Gaza in the same sense that South Africa's regional belligerence was intended to protect apartheid?
Not primarily. I think Israel's motivations need to be seen in several related contexts. The first concerns Israeli-Iranian relations. The second concerns Israel's position in the region. And the third concerns the changing geopolitical posture of the United States. If we look at the first, since the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, which ended the close strategic alliance that had existed for decades between Israel and Iran, regime change in Iran has been an ambition and aspiration of the Israelis. In fact, soon after the Shah was ousted from power in 1979, Israel's last ambassador to Iran, Uri Librani, proposed recruiting a group of royalists who, in his words, would be prepared to shoot dead 10,000 demonstrators in the streets of Tehran to restore the Shah to power. That's how important royalist Iran was to Israel. The new Iranian leaders were intrinsically hostile to Israel for a number of reasons. I would argue, first and foremost, because of Israel's very close association with the ousted monarchical regime. Secondly, they embraced the Palestinian cause. And in fact, one of their first acts was to hand the keys to the shuttered Israeli embassy in Tehran to the Palestine Liberation Organization. And they did this both out of genuine conviction and because Iran's new leaders, in fact, many of whom had been trained in PLO training camps in Lebanon, also felt that embracing the Palestinian cause would bolster their regional credentials, their credentials in the broader Islamic world. At a time when they, in the initial revolutionary fervor, Iran was also hoping to overthrow the conservative Arab regimes in the region, and then, of course, was involved in an 8-year-long war with Iraq after it had been attacked by Iraq. And so Israeli-Iranian relations, despite important exceptions where Israel, for example, helped Iran secure weapons during its war with Iraq. Your listeners will be familiar with the Iran-Contra scandal, where Israel pursued a policy of keeping this war going for as long as possible in order to weaken both parties to this war. Those exceptions notwithstanding, Israeli-Iranian relations since 1979 have been characterized primarily by hostility and often by fierce hostility, and increasingly in recent years by regional rivalry. Now, seen from Israel's perspective, I think its primary motivation is maintaining its monopoly on the possession of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. As is universally known, but all too rarely acknowledged, Israel is a bona fide nuclear power, which possesses several hundred nuclear warheads. It is the only state in the Middle East that has a nuclear arsenal, and it is determined to maintain this nuclear hegemony. There's only two ways to deal with that. Either we move towards a nuclear weapons-free Middle East, which is a non-starter for Israel, or alternatively, Israel has to ensure not only that no other state in the Middle East acquires nuclear weapons, but also that no other state in the Middle East acquires the capacity to eventually develop nuclear weapons. And that explains Israel's attack on the nuclear reactor in Iraq in 1981, more recently in Syria in 2007. And I believe that rather than anything to do with Gaza, is a primary motivation of the war that Israel launched against Iran on the 13th of June. Then there's a regional context. And the regional context is that Israel views all its enemies as subservient proxies of Iran, very similar to how during the Cold War, every local conflict was seen as a product of the machinations of the Soviet bogeyman. Local parties didn't really have any real grievances. They were just fighting because they were ordered to by the communists and by the Soviet Union and so on. So Israel takes a very similar position towards Palestinians, Lebanese, Yemenis, anyone who opposes them. And of course, these various parties are aligned in a coalition that describes itself as the axis of resistance. And what happened on the 7th of October is that Israel was engulfed by total chaos and disarray. And of course, that same day initiated its genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip. But over the course of the last summer, the summer of 2024, Israel appeared to have regained its confidence and gone on the offensive. Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza were already significantly weakened. It was constantly attacking militants in the West Bank. Then it had its extraordinarily successful campaign against Hezbollah in Lebanon, which didn't eradicate the movement, far from it, but significantly weakened it. And more importantly, transformed the domestic political scene within Lebanon, which further constrained Hezbollah. Now, the way Israel looks at this is that all these various movements, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, the militias in Iraq, and so on, are really nothing more than tentacles of the Iranian octopus, as Israelis put it. Well, if that's your perspective, you can't just chop off the tentacles and disentangle them from each other. Ultimately, you need to crush the head of the octopus. And that, I think, is the regional context. And the third, just very briefly, is, I don't put much store by this idea of a U.S. pivot to Asia. The U.S. remains a superpower and is quite capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time. But nevertheless, after it withdrew from Iraq and then more recently Afghanistan, and given the changing nature of many of its relationships in the Middle East, particularly under the second Trump administration, it does not want to remain as deeply committed to the security order in the Middle East, if you will, as it has been previously. It wants to kind of farm this out. And I think this is a way for Israel to entangle the United States into maintaining a very sharp focus and direct involvement in the Middle East, because, of course, this helps serve Israeli interests as well. That, I think, constitute the main explanations of why Israel decided to launch this war. And of course, it was also to sabotage U.S.-Iranian diplomacy, which I suspect we'll get into later. It has the added benefit, if I can put it that way, of diverting attention from the genocide in Gaza, which continues to intensify. But given the effectively unconditional support that Israel has enjoyed for this genocide, not only from the United States, but also from the European Union and many European states, which, as far as Israel is concerned, are the only ones that count. I don't think Israel felt compelled to start a war to divert criticism, of which there was not very much from what it was doing against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip.
It's clear that Europe has generally, with a few exceptions, been in lockstep with the U.S. in backing Israel throughout the genocide. But in the weeks leading up to the attack on Iran, we did begin to see some shifts, at least in rhetoric and with the UK's sanctions against Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, some shifts towards beginning maybe to put pressure on Israel around the genocide in Gaza. And yet Israel launching this new military adventure on Iran seems to then snap those same European powers back into lockstep with Washington and Israel's brutally murderous program. Why does Israel becoming more belligerent have this perverse effect of bringing the European powers back in line, lockstep with Israel?
Well, I'll answer your question in two parts. And the first is to look at the significance of these measures that were taken by various Europeans in the weeks prior to Israel launching its war against Iran. You mentioned Great Britain, which suspended negotiations for a free trade agreement with Israel, then took the unprecedented step of imposing sanctions, basically a travel ban and an asset freeze on two senior extreme right government ministers. And then the European Union announced a review of its association agreement with Israel. The association agreement is essentially a free trade agreement that was concluded between the European Union and Israel in 2000, I believe, that gave Israel all kinds of trade privileges with the European Union, in addition to access to many EU programs, almost as if it was a member of the bloc. And Article 2 of the association agreement, which was incorporated into the agreement, I think due to widespread public pressure about the human rights situation in the occupied territories, essentially obliged Israel to ensure respect for fundamental human rights as a condition for the implementation of this agreement. Of course, the moment it was signed, the Europeans pretended the agreement didn't include this article, and for the past 25 years have essentially taken the position that there is no human rights issue of any concern, or at least of sufficient concern, that would cause the EU to conduct a review of its association agreement. Now, I'm not going to dismiss any of these measures out of hand, as some other people have done, I think for understandable reasons. But nevertheless, a threshold seems to have been crossed. When a country as closely aligned with Israel as Great Britain, under perhaps its most pro-Israeli prime minister since Margaret Thatcher, Keir Starmer, when his government takes these measures, you don't dismiss them out of hand. At the same time, they raise very serious questions. These two ministers serve in a government led by a fugitive from international justice, the indicted war criminal Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. More importantly, the motivation, the explanation for these sanctions was these two ministers' incitement to violence. In other words, it's because of what they said, what these individuals said, rather than because of the policies that their government was implementing, whether the genocide in the Gaza Strip or the almost daily pogroms and military violence and expansion of illegal settlements and maintenance and deepening of an occupation that has been ruled illegal by the International Court of Justice and so on.
It's the brazenly exterminationist language rather than the actual extermination, which poses a problem for European liberals.
Exactly. So, yes, I mean, you almost get the sense that the Europeans wanted to have avoided taking these measures. They could have avoided taking these measures, but ultimately their hand was forced by the openly genocidal, shamelessly extremist statements by senior Israeli government ministers that left them with no choice. And so I think these measures, even though I think it's fair to say that they, on the one hand, are significant, but at the same time were intended as a diversion from the real issues and in order to avoid taking concrete, meaningful actions against Israel, nevertheless represent a very narrow opening, which can and should be exploited by public pressure, by politicians who are dissatisfied to build on them. As far as the European Union is concerned, I think Brussels is long past hopeless. There are possibilities, I think, with individual European governments, but the EU quite clearly, particularly under its current leadership, would rather see, the union destroyed than have to take any measures against Israel. Now, when you look at the role of the Europeans in the run-up to this war, a few days or a week or so before Israel launched its war, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, for the first time in 2 decades, determined that Iran was in violation of its commitments to the agency under the terms of its membership. That resolution passed only because it was this time supported by key European parties. And in hindsight, it seems to me pretty clear that they were helping to lay the basis to legitimize Israel's subsequent attack on Iran. And if you look at the first EU response, which came after Israel attacked Iran, but before Iran commenced its retaliation against Israel, their statement was to endorse Israel's right of self-defense. So a war, an unprovoked war of aggression, as far as Europe is concerned, when it's conducted by Israel, is a legitimate act of self-defense. And Israel wasn't defending itself against anything at that point because Iran hadn't retaliated. Now, why do they do this? Look, the new German Prime Minister, Friedrich Merz, gave a statement that was widely derided, in which he said, Israel is doing our dirty work in the Middle East, and I hope they succeed. If it was just him, we could have a discussion. But you look at senior politicians throughout the West, in Europe, in Great Britain, in the US, and they're all basically saying Israel is fighting our fight. And so, we can have a long discussion about the role and influence of the Israel lobby, but ultimately, I think all of them genuinely see Israel as a reliable proxy for securing and advancing Western interests in a very volatile, but nevertheless geopolitically vital region of the world. And that, to me, is the ultimate explanation for Western support of Israel.
On a recent episode of the Citations Needed podcast, Adam Johnson and Nima Shirazi discussed how, in the lead up to Israel launching these attacks, they discussed how mainstream media, particularly in the US, but I'm sure not exclusively, repeatedly reported on Israel's potential to strike Iran, almost as though such an assault would be enforcing the International Atomic Energy Agency, enforcing the IAEA decision to, for the first time in 2 decades, as you just said, rule Iran out of compliance. But those reports routinely failed to mention what you just pointed out, which was the shift in the votes of the European powers. And the reporting also failed to mention, surprise, surprise, that Israel itself isn't subject to IAEA oversight because, unlike Iran, Israel is not a signatory to the Treaty on the Nonproliferation of Nuclear Weapons. And that's, of course, as you mentioned, because Israel has a large undeclared nuclear arsenal. And so the upshot is that this bizarre situation where Israel is portrayed as the enforcer of a liberal international order whose treaties it is not a party to in actuality. What's the role played by the Western and maybe particularly American press in laying the groundwork for legitimating the Israeli war on Iran? What sort of contortions have you seen the media engage in to present this Israeli aggression as somehow a preemptive war or a war of self-defense, and in doing so, eliding the basic reality of Israeli aggression and of Israel's interest in maintaining its nuclear monopoly in the region?
You're raising a crucial point and looking at Israel's, self-proclaimed role of enforcing nuclear non-proliferation and the West's support for it. I've likened it to a drunken sailor slurring his way through a sermon about sobriety and then immediately going to the bar and demanding another drink and getting gifted a free bottle on the house by the Western bartender in appreciation for his oratory. I mean, it's so Kafkaesque. As you said, Israel is a nuclear power. This is almost never discussed. You can almost say it's never discussed. Israel is determined to secure and maintain its monopoly on the possession of nuclear weapons. Israel has, in fact, or senior Israeli officials have threatened to use nuclear weapons against the Gaza Strip, for example, in late 23 and late 24. This largely passed without comment either. Now, as far as enforcement of nuclear nonproliferation, well, a nuclear power bombing the nuclear installations of a non-nuclear power is not exactly conforming to Article 51 of the UN Charter and what is universally acknowledged as a distinguishing between legitimate and illegitimate forms of self-defense. And as far as self-defense is concerned, the right of self-defense does not mean you have to wait to be attacked first before you respond. But it also doesn't mean you're allowed to launch a war against another country because they don't like you, or because they say they would rather you didn't exist, or because they've become a nuclear threshold state where there's no evidence by the leading specialists that they have taken the political decision to become a nuclear power. Anticipatory self-defense is when you have certain information that you are facing an imminent attack from a hostile state, and you are then allowed to use armed force to prevent that attack from taking place. So something that you know, in a manner of speaking, is going to happen tomorrow morning, not in 2035. But I'm a little hesitant to have this discussion about international law and the liberal order and so on because these things no longer exist. Its self-proclaimed guardians and champions, working hand in glove with Israel, have systematically shredded international law, international humanitarian law, the laws of armed conflict, the rule book, if you will. They have been systematically shredded over the past 2 years and lie buried under the rubble of the Gaza Strip. I guess the only addition now is that the nuclear regulatory regime that has been developed during the nuclear age is now being shredded as well. So, we can have an academic theoretical discussion about these issues, but they're entirely meaningless because we now live in the jungle in which everyone has been told that you are entitled to act like a beast. That's the world that we now live in.
And if you could expand a little bit on the question of the mainstream media disinformation, because obviously for a very long time since the lead up to the war in Iraq, probably before, I've read publications like the New York Times with a great degree of skepticism, but I've never in my life had this experience of almost daily total Orwellian disassociation that I have reading publications like the New York Times since October 7th.
Yes, and the Western mainstream media has effectively served as a stenographer for Israeli genocide. I mean, British Broadcasting Corporation, which is increasingly known as the BB Broadcasting Corporation. I mean, people have suggested that it should rename itself to Israel Says, because I'm sure you've seen these interviews where rather than questioning a guest and letting them speak and challenging their responses, much and often most of the interview is taken up by the presenter repeating Israeli talking points. And this is what you're reading in mainstream newspapers as well. And it's, of course, if a government, a state, a movement, an official says something that is demonstrably false, I would argue it's the responsibility of the media to report that. But it's also the responsibility of the media, if they possess information that the state or government or movement or official is lying through their teeth, to expose that. And if the state or official in question has a record of systematically lying and fabricating, then maybe, next time they're introduced, you put on kind of a warning. But we never see that. I mean, I'll give you an example. Since October 7th, 2023, Israel has systematically prevented foreign journalists from entering the Gaza Strip. And of course, Palestinian journalists in the Gaza Strip have performed an absolutely heroic job.
while being systematically assassinated.
Yes, have been killed in unprecedented numbers in any modern conflict, along with aid workers, medics, and all the rest of it. And they're, of course, dismissed out of hand as Hamas because everything that gets killed is Hamas. But how often have you seen these kind of warnings where, now I'm seeing, for example, the BBC informing its audience that the Iranian government has restricted it in terms of its reporting from Iran. How often, when they introduce a story about the Gaza Strip, do they remind their readers and listeners and viewers that they are prohibited from entering the Gaza Strip? More to the point, I'm absolutely certain, given that this is also very much a propaganda war, that if these key media institutions collectively informed the Israeli government that unless and until they were given access to the Gaza Strip, that they would no longer report on Israeli government statements, that they would no longer interview Israeli officials or Israeli government proxies, it would probably take about 6 hours and 12 minutes until Israel would relent and allow these journalists to enter the Gaza Strip and report on everything for themselves. There's only one reason they're preventing these journalists from entering, because they don't want foreign journalists who are much better known to their audiences and probably considered more credible to their audiences to report on what's really happening. And for these media, it's very convenient. They know exactly what's going on, but since they haven't seen it with their own eyes, they can pretend it's not happening.
Not very long ago, Trump claimed that he was prioritizing the negotiation of a new nuclear deal with Iran and was holding Israel back from attacking. But Trump has since then loudly and bellicosely endorsed Israel's assault. It now also seems clear that the U.S. was providing assistance from the beginning of the attacks. How real was the tension between Trump and Netanyahu over whether to negotiate with or attack Iran? Did Netanyahu essentially force Trump's hand to back Israel's attack and potentially to directly bomb Iran, something that's being decided as we speak? Or was the whole exercise of negotiations always a ruse? Eskandar Sadeghi-Boroujerdi wrote an essay in New Left Review's Sidecar blog in which he says, quote, "When Trump returned to the White House this year and signaled that a new deal might be within reach, the incumbent Pezekian government agreed to engage in further talks. It is now abundantly clear, however, that this diplomacy was never serious. For the U.S., the goal was not to reach agreement, but to force surrender." He continues, quote, "Beneath Trump's talk of deal-making was a maximalist demand, not only that Iran abandon its civilian nuclear program, but that it dismantle its missile arsenal and regional alliances as well. This is what Netanyahu has repeatedly called the Libya option. Not détente or normalization, but total capitulation of the kind that Tehran was never going to accept. In light of this, the theatrics of Trump's supposed falling out with Netanyahu now look like a strategic maneuver rather than a real policy divergence, a means to disorient the Iranians while preparations for war were underway. But you disagreed, writing, quote, "There was indisputably U.S.-Israeli collusion to attack Iran, but it is of fairly recent provenance. Washington did not devise Trump's approach to Khamenei and multiple rounds of negotiations with Iran as camouflage for a military strike that was always the objective. But once it was persuaded that Israeli aggression would serve its actual objective of an agreement with Iran, it participated fully." What do you make of Eskandar's argument here, and why, to put it bluntly, why do you think your analysis is the correct one?
Well, I'm not going to say he's right and I'm wrong, but
I respect you both a lot. That's why I'm
look, indisputably, the war that Israel launched on Iran required a U.S. green light, and the U.S. was deeply involved in the preparations and all the rest of it. The more pertinent question, in my view, is whether the second Trump administration entered office determined to initiate a military confrontation with Iran, or whether it was persuaded to do so more recently. I believe it was a more recent development, and let me explain why. If you'll recall, during the first Trump administration that started, 2017 to 2021, Trump, I think the day after he appointed John World War VI Bolton as his national security advisor, renounced the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement. He replaced that with a policy of maximum pressure, conducted the assassination of probably the most visible and charismatic senior Iranian general, the head of the Quds Force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Qasem Soleimani, and so on. Now, the situation that you had during the first Trump administration was a very close alignment between the United States, Israel, and the conservative Arab states, who were all agreed on a policy of maximum pressure on Iran. They all wanted to see the nuclear agreement repudiated. They all shared the objective of isolating Iran, weakening it, and, if they had their way, effectuating regime change in Tehran. But something fundamental happened between the first and the second Trump administration. In 2019, if I recall correctly, Iran, although it didn't claim responsibility, but everyone who's looked at it has concluded that it was the Iranians, conducted a highly sophisticated and very effective drone and missile attack on the most important Aramco facilities in eastern Saudi Arabia and basically knocked them offline for a few days. The US did not respond. As the Yemen war continued to escalate, the Houthis in northern Yemen began launching growing numbers of drones and missiles directly into Saudi territory and thereafter into Emirati territory as well. And these states came to the conclusion that neither the United States nor Israel were willing or able to defend them against what they viewed as Iranian directed attacks on their territory. And during the Biden years, in fact, these Gulf states normalized relations with Iran. In Saudi Arabia's case, through a deal mediated and brokered by not by the United States or the Europeans, but by China. And these states had come to the conclusion that a direct military confrontation between the United States and Iran was not in their interests because they would be in the front line and the consequences and the repercussions for them would be devastating economically, physically, and all the rest of it. The second Trump administration comes into office, and these states, which have significant influence in Washington, both because of the close alliance and because, Trump has basically put a for sale sign on U.S. foreign policy, and they're indisputably the highest bidders, as we saw during Trump's recent tour of the Gulf, began encouraging Trump to pursue a negotiated agreement with Iran. There's no love lost between these leaders and Iran, and if it was up to them, they would be rid of the Islamic Republic tomorrow morning, if not this evening. But they view the costs of doing so as prohibitive, and were encouraging the Trump administration to pursue negotiations. Simultaneously, within the United States, as you know, the non-interventionist constituency was increasingly drifting from the Democratic Party, which increasingly became the war party, to the Republican Party and the MAGA cult. And so you had these deep divisions between non-interventionists on the one hand and kind of the neocons, the war hawks, and the Israel acolytes on the other. And Israel was really the only party that was fully committed to not only rejecting any agreement with Iran, but actively promoting direct military confrontation with Iran. And what we saw is that against this background, Trump in March, with Netanyahu sitting next to him so that he would be properly neutralized, announced that the US and Iran would begin negotiations in the Omani capital, Muscat, that weekend. My sense of course, I wasn't in the room, so I can't give you a definitive answer. But looking at all the available evidence that I have before me, I've come to the conclusion that Trump was actually seeking a negotiated agreement with Iran in order to avoid what would have inevitably become an armed confrontation that would make Iraq look like child's play. But, we're now in the midst of a war. So let me take a moment and explain how I believe we got from A to B. When the negotiations commenced, and as I'm sure you've seen from the statements that Trump and other American officials were making, they were very clear that their red line was that Iran could not and never could possess a nuclear weapon. That was something that could have been negotiated between the parties. Iran's position was that it was willing to verifiably, permanently renounce any ambition to develop a nuclear weapon, but that it insisted on maintaining the rights it had under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which, as we mentioned earlier, that unlike Israel, Iran has signed, to pursue low-grade nuclear enrichment on its own territory in accordance with its rights under the NPT. And I think the reason Iran wanted to do this was to maintain the know-how and the scientific basis and so on for its nuclear program. Then all of a sudden, the US changed its tune. And I believe that, Trump and Witkoff are not exactly the brightest bulbs in the room. They know very little about the Middle East, certainly next to nothing about anything in the Middle East that doesn't involve real estate. They don't know Iran. And in addition, Elon Musk has gutted the relevant government agencies that can provide them with knowledge and expertise on these issues. In my view, a coalition of Israel, its loyalists in the US government, Iran hawks, neocons, and so on, managed to successfully persuade Trump and Witkoff that compelling Iran to renounce any uranium enrichment on its own territory was a viable negotiating strategy. It was quite clearly a demand that was formulated in order to be rejected. And if I can just take a step back, you mentioned the Libya model, and you may recall that when certain American officials first began touting the Libya model, they were quickly removed because Trump recognized that anyone who says Libya model is basically trying to sabotage negotiations. But this time, ending uranium enrichment on Iranian territory was sold to them as a viable negotiating position. Then when the Iranians, as anyone who's familiar with the issue would have told you, rejected that, I think Trump was then sold this idea that an Israeli attack on Iran, which I'm sure was marketed as short and sharp and very effective, a decapitation strike similar to that conducted against Hezbollah last year. I don't think it was sold as regime change. I think it was marketed to Trump as softening up the Iranians, bringing them to their knees, as a result of which the United States could basically dictate the terms of any new agreement to the Iranians. That, of course, also didn't work. And what is now being proposed is, one massive U.S. bombing run against Fordo nuclear reactor, and that will lead either to Iran capitulating or to the restoration of Pahlavi rule in Iran.
After the potential murder of Khomeini.
Yes, that too.
So while you have the pro, in this story, we have the pro-Israel Iran hawk coalition winning out to push Trump to back Israel's attack in Trump's formulation. the way it's sold to him, as a way to force them to capitulate at the negotiating table. But now we have Trump toying with the threat of direct U.S. involvement. And that has opened up a major conflict within the right and the MAGA America First camp that is extraordinarily hostile to the more Israel-aligned neocon Iran hawk camp has exploded in fury, from Marjorie Taylor Greene to, I mean, most spectacularly, Tucker Carlson, who eviscerated Ted Cruz in that recent interview and separately wrote, quote, "Drop Israel, let them fight their own wars." Do you think this contradiction will prove to be a really consequentially explosive one for the U.S.'s reigning far-right coalition, or will this anti-interventionist far-right camp, despite their fury, find that moving Trump away from Europe and Ukraine is one thing, and moving Trump away from Israel another thing entirely?
What does it say about U.S. political culture when the sanest voices in the room are two lunatics, Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene? And what does it say about the U.S. media when it is Tucker Carlson who is asking the questions that everyone else has been systematically avoiding all this time?
Profoundly depressing.
Yes, and scandalous, frankly. Now, regarding your question, it's very difficult to answer because, of course, we're not dealing with a political party so much as a personality cult. And, when you're dealing with a personality cult, you challenge it at your own peril. Look at what happened to the richest man in the world when he thought his money would enable him to challenge the personality cult. When's the last time you saw a major story about Elon Musk that didn't involve one of his rockets exploding? The guy is basically, at least temporarily, disappeared from public view. I do think it will be consequential, but that would probably be more in the sense of people drifting away from the MAGA movement than launching a successful challenge against its maximum leader. And the other thing to know about Trump, of course, is that he is an exceptionally gifted and effective demagogue. So it's going to be very difficult, for any of his detractors to successfully challenge him. We see something similar with Netanyahu. He's also a gifted and effective demagogue, nothing compared to his master in the White House. But, those who challenge them do so at their own peril because they usually end up as mincemeat. But I do think that the hesitation you're now seeing in the White House about launching an attack on Iran is the result of two factors. The first is the one we're discussing, and I think that Trump is sensitive to significant splits in his constituency and political base, particularly when people who he has often relied upon give him dissenting voices. And the other is that Trump apparently has doubts about the effectiveness of the bombing raid on Fordo nuclear reactor that's being proposed as kind of the silver bullet. And of course, he doesn't want to end up presiding over a conflict that makes Iraq look like the cakewalk it was advertised to be in 2003. And it struck me that in recent days, Trump has repeatedly praised what he terms the effectiveness and success of the Israeli war against Iran. Could it be that what he's basically saying is the Israelis are doing so well they don't need me anymore?
Mission accomplished.
Yes, exactly. Or maybe, the problem with Trump is that you can take nothing the man says seriously, but you can't afford to take anything he says not literally. So, the US bombing runs on Iran may have been canceled or may commence as we speak. This is a leader and administration that is kind of all over the place and is very difficult to predict.
I mean, the madman theory is all the more effective if the man in question is literally mad.
Yes.
As you have gestured towards, I think the past 2 decades plus of U.S. politics have been powerfully shaped by anti-war sentiment, just in incredibly inchoate ways. These anti-war sentiments coursed through the first and second Trump campaigns, Obama's first run, Howard Dean's 2004 primary campaign. There's just been a general hostility to foreign wars in the wake of the War on Terror's profound ongoing failures to achieve their stated aims. Instead of those stated aims, of course, massive ongoing disaster. And on the left, that anti-war sentiment has a more anti-imperialist or internationalist valence, but in its mainstream and right-wing variants, it's been a more nationalist opposition to putting American troops in harm's way. And so the question of who channels this often ambient, inchoate anti-war sentiment and to what end, it's a really important question. And as you mentioned, Democrats, with some typical exceptions from the likes of Bernie and AOC and some others, they've refused to make their opposition to Trump and to Trump's authoritarianism, Trump's fascism. They've refused to make it an anti-war opposition, let alone an anti-genocide opposition. And similarly, major liberal resistance groups organizing some really giant protests against Trump, they've likewise failed to make opposition to war and genocide central to their anti-fascist politics, really making it part of their anti-fascist politics at all. And they've, not uncommonly by contrast, underlined support for Ukraine as a sort of extension of their anti-authoritarianism, whereby American promotion of democracy, or at least resistance to Putin, it's like a martial or global corollary to their fight to preserve Southern voting rights or to prosecute January 6 rioters. My question is, what are the consequences of this all? When and if MAGA anti-interventionists, and not the Democratic Party or liberal base, when it's MAGA, when and if it is MAGA that stops Trump from intervening in Iran, knock on wood, 2 decades after the Democratic Party backed Bush starting the war on terror and invading Iraq, amid ongoing Democratic Party support for the genocide in Gaza, in the face of strong opposition from the Democratic Party base. What does that mean for domestic American politics, for the Democratic Party to continue to fail, not to fail, to refuse to absorb these massively powerful anti-war energies that have been coursing through American politics for more than 2 decades?
Well, you're asking me a question that's above my pay grade, but I'll offer my thoughts nonetheless. These anti-interventionist voters, if you will, I think massively voted for Obama, not once, but twice, and felt completely betrayed. And I think that's an important part of the explanation of Trump's first victory. Then you had the Biden administration that was overcome with pro-Israeli ideological fervor at its most senior ranks, beginning, of course, with Biden himself, and unconditionally embraced Israeli genocide. And then when Biden was replaced with Harris, her managers thought it was actually a winning strategy to make a public display of contempt against the Arab American community as kind of a surrogate of the anti-genocide vote. That, of course, worked out wonderfully, and she's now been in the White House for almost half a year. And now you have Trump, who, as I said, is ahead of a personality cult, in large part because many of his supporters see him as kind of an icon against forever wars, an anti-interventionist icon. Now, if Trump chooses to participate in Israel's war against Iran, which I should add, but we can get into this later, is really already a U.S.-Israeli war, although I think it's being led by Israel in contrast to other ones. Then my view is that he cannot be challenged from within the personality cult, but you will see growing numbers of people drifting away from it in a context where the alternative is not the Democratic Party. I mean, you look at their leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, his main criticism of Trump is that Trump is chickening out on holding Iran accountable for whatever it is. So, that's hardly kind of the natural alternative if you're an anti-interventionist. I think the Democratic Party is basically beholden to its party elites, to its funders, and so on, and is no longer capable of representing its constituencies. And in a two-party system, when you believe that neither party provides a political home and there is no organized opposition at lower levels of organization, I think that presents an extraordinarily dangerous situation where you can have all kinds of off the rails thinking and conspiracy theories and far right activism and so on. It's a very dangerous and combustible reality that could develop where the political system is seen by an increasing number of people as no longer capable, in fact, unwilling to address any of their basic needs or accommodating even any of their most important perspectives.
I mean, to put it really bluntly, I think if you reject a more left-wing internationalist anti-imperialist lens to assess what the hell is going on in this nightmare of a world, then the far right's plausible alternative is essentially various forms of Nazism, racism, and anti-Semitism, to explain it.
Yes, I mean again, where you don't have an organized opposition and you don't have existing movements capable, organized enough to receive such disaffected people, they could go anywhere. And this the United States, of course, has a history of very far right activism, often centered on racial issues, which are becoming increasingly prominent as well. So it's a very dangerous reality that we could be entering into. I mean, I'm not in any way suggesting the current administration is not far right, but you get my point.
It could get worse. Biden obviously had this profound, romantic, bizarre, ideological commitment to Israel and to Zionism. Do you believe that most other Democratic presidents would have allowed Israel to kill maybe a few thousand people in Gaza, but then stopped them at some point?
No, I think Biden was sui generis. He was a case apart, and it's telling. When if you read the Israeli press as I do regularly, in late 23 and early 24, prominent correspondents and commentators were consistently saying the clock is running out. Washington is going to call time on our offensive, because that's traditionally what happens. The Palestine question is not of particular significance to Washington. It doesn't involve core national security or economic interests, and Israel is usually allowed to have its way. But what typically happens is that at a certain point, the White House, perhaps at the urging of the Pentagon or the State Department, is informed that things are getting out of hand, and if we don't pull the plug on what Israel is doing, it could affect our broader regional interests. And then you get a phone call from the White House.
Like when Reagan picked up the phone to
Yes,
call Menachem
a
Begin in
perfect example.
1982 during the assault on Beirut.
Perfect example. And what happened in 1982 is not that Reagan saw pictures of burnt and dismembered children and was so outraged that he called the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. What happened is that Reagan got a call from Prince Fahd, who was then the Saudi crown prince, and was informed that, you have to do something because if this continues, it's going to jeopardize our own position. And, that was a kind of warning sign. The call went to Israel. And 2021 is a very good example when there was another Israeli onslaught on the Gaza Strip, and you had congressional testimony at the time by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, General Mark Milley, and he made a statement to the effect that if this continues much longer, it puts our wider regional interests at risk. And it was very shortly thereafter that Biden called Netanyahu, and I'm quoting verbatim now, says, "You've run out of road." And lo and behold, it stopped. I do believe that any other president would not have tolerated the escalation and continuation of the genocide in the way that Biden did. And I think Exhibit A is an interview with the previous Israeli ambassador to Washington, Michael Herzog, at the end of his term, who basically said, and I'm paraphrasing, that Israel viewed Biden as a gift from God because they kept anticipating that the call from Washington would come telling them they had to stop, and it never came.
Hi, this is Olufemi O. Taiwo, and you're listening to The Dig. You can support the podcast at patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by In These Times, an independent nonprofit magazine dedicated to advancing democracy and economic justice. The latest issue of In These Times features in-depth profiles of the winners of the inaugural Labor Organizer of the Year award. From a longtime UPS Teamster who's leading the organizing at Amazon, to a daughter of an incarcerated father who's worked with formerly incarcerated workers to win huge victories even in this moment of reaction, to an anonymous immigrant organizer who helped win legal status for dozens of their co-workers. In These Times is committed to journalism and analysis that will help workers win. Dig listeners can get a special subscription offer at inthesetimes.com/dig. Just $15 gets you 10 print issues over the next year. That's inthesetimes.com/dig. We've seen Trump directly negotiate with Hamas and secure a ceasefire, something that the Biden administration always refused to do. But then we saw Trump allow Israel to break that ceasefire, as an aside, something that, with few exceptions, was almost never, ever clearly reported in the American media. The Financial Times, at least sometimes, does. So we saw Trump allow Israel to break that ceasefire and then dramatically intensify the genocide in Gaza. Today, Israel is starving Palestinians in Gaza, letting in just a tiny amount of food after kicking the UN humanitarian agency out and putting in this bizarre U.S. Boston Consulting Group designed front group, and then massacring hundreds of Palestinians trying to reach that food. And it's really just among the most sadistic things among so many months of such unbelievably evil acts. And that's all just to set up the question of, how would you characterize Trump's approach to the Gaza genocide and whatever substantive differences there are from Biden's orientation?
Well, what you described is the most lethal aid operation on record, for the simple reason that it isn't an aid operation. It's a project designed to replace the aid operations that were in place in order to seize control of the aid, weaponize it, and subordinate it to the objectives and the agenda of Israel's genocide in the Gaza Strip. Look, when Trump was elected, my sense is that he did not want to enter office with a foreign policy crisis on his plate, least of all one that included U.S. hostages in the Middle East. You'll recall Carter had just recently passed away, and everyone was recounting the Iranian hostage crisis and so on. And so Trump sent Witkoff to the Middle East. This is before his inauguration, to achieve a ceasefire. And it was a very easy thing to do because Biden had proposed an agreement in May of 2024 that Hamas had accepted in early July of 2024 that Israel never accepted, and that the Biden administration, of course, said Israel had accepted, but Hamas had rejected. And the Qataris later said that this is, in fact, an agreement that could have been concluded in late 2023. In any event, Witkoff required only one meeting with Netanyahu to compel Netanyahu to accept this agreement, and a ceasefire or a three-stage agreement was announced on the 19th of January, or went into force, I think, on the 19th of January of this year. And that meant not only that Trump's inauguration proceeded without a foreign policy crisis, but that he entered office as someone who had already achieved something before he even walked into the White House. And the question was always whether, for Trump, was the priority the optics on the 20th of January, Inauguration Day, or was he genuinely seeking to resolve this issue? Now, without going into the details of this agreement, what happened is that in February, the Israelis persuaded Witkoff to change the terms of the agreement several weeks after it had been endorsed by the parties and come into force and was being implemented. In other words, Witkoff lifted the goalposts and shifted them out of reach of anything Hamas was willing or could have accepted. And that laid the basis for the unprecedented siege that began on the 2nd of March, and the renewal and intensification of the genocide that began with a massive Israeli bombing campaign that left 400 dead on its first day on the 18th of March of this year. And, other people are looking, if we back to Iran for a moment, the Iranians have seen how duplicitous the Trump administration was with respect to the Gaza agreement. They remember the Trump administration as the one that reneged on the JCPOA in 2018, and look at Witkoff again as the one who sought to shift the goalposts after several rounds of initial negotiations. Now, that does not augur well to all these diplomatic contacts between Witkoff and the Iranian foreign minister, and between the Iranians and the Europeans, that are apparently ongoing as we speak, because I think, the Iranians are going to insist on clarity and guarantees in a situation where they might otherwise have accepted some kind of constructive ambiguity, or whatever you want to call it. And so my view is that in Gaza, essentially it was given to Israel as compensation for the negotiations with Iran. And again, as far as Washington is, I mean, the United States does not have a policy against genocide. Preventing famine in the Gaza Strip is not a U.S. foreign policy priority. And Palestinians are disposable as far as the US and the Europeans are concerned. And if you have to satisfy Israel's bloodlust in order to ensure its cooperation on other issues, then so be it. It's a price considered well worth paying. And again, I think that the key players in this equation now are the Arab states. I think it is only when they mobilize sufficient influence and pressure on the Trump administration to put an end to this that the Trump administration will do so. But we haven't seen that. When Trump went to the region, their priorities seemed to be lifting sanctions on Syria and encouraging diplomatic engagement with Iran.
And generating deals.
Yeah,
doing
bilateral
deals.
relations, of course, first and foremost. I'm talking about the regional issues that were discussed. But I'm absolutely certain, that if these Arab states were to renounce their role of inert spectators and mobilize their influence in order to put pressure on the Americans to end this. But that's not the world we live in, and that's not going to happen.
I want to talk about the sort of basic debate over the US's commitment to Israel, which is basically, is U.S. support for Israel a question of political capture? Is it a matter of the Israel lobby, the power of various activated domestic constituencies, the personal ideological orientation of powerful state actors, the ideological conception of American interests that dominates the foreign policy blob, or instead, is there some deeper structural necessity here in terms of the geopolitical underpinnings of American political and economic power that Israel uniquely, perhaps singularly for some reason, serves for U.S. imperialism in the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East? And this is an important question because if it's just ideological or about the Israel lobby, then we on the American anti-imperialist left, we can imagine driving a wedge between the interests of Zionism and of U.S. foreign policy. But if it's more functional to U.S. empire at some deeper structural level, then it's perhaps a much tougher nut to crack. What's your take?
It's functional. It's certainly true that Israel enjoys more political power domestically in Congress, in the media, and so on, than any other foreign state in U.S. history. That's indisputable. I mean, you just look at kind of all, the repression of campus protests and anti-boycott laws. I mean, the United States is in that unique position of tolerating more expressions of hostility towards itself than towards a foreign state. You can get up in Times Square and you can call for a boycott of the United States. You can call for the dismantling of the US state. You can call for the destruction of the United States, and that will be considered freedom of speech. You say the same things about Israel, you end up in a gulag in Louisiana. So that's all certainly true, but ultimately, Israel enjoys the support of the US, not because of its influence in the US, but because it serves US interests in the Middle East. It's a proxy. And the proxy in this relationship is not the United States, the proxy of Israel. And there's a relatively simple test through which to evaluate this assumption. When not you or I, but when US decision makers and Israeli decision makers believe that their interests are clashing, who wins? And we have very clear examples. We have 1956, when Israel participated in the tripartite aggression against Egypt, along with Great Britain and France, during which, by the way, the Gaza Strip was occupied by Israel for the first time for 7 months. And the US ordered Israel to evacuate the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip, and it did so. In 1982, the Reagan administration wanted to sell advanced AWACS and other weaponry to Saudi Arabia. That was at a time where Israel was opposed to any weapons transfers to any Arab country. The sale was made. In 2015, Israel pulled out all the stops to prevent the United States from joining the Iran nuclear agreement. And the US joined. And just getting back to our earlier conversation, in every war Israel has launched, it ends when the US says time is up, not when Israel says I'm done. And Israel is seen as a reliable proxy of US and Western interests in the Middle East. Now, I'll admit that this relationship was consolidated during the Cold War, and increasing questions were raised about it when the Soviet Union was no longer. Why do we need this expensive policemen in the Middle East, especially when with the US invasion of Iraq and so on, we can do it ourselves. But then you look at the statements that are being made. Okay, Ted Cruz believes that, he's supporting genocide in Gaza because that's what God wants him to do. And he doesn't even know which verse of the Bible to quote in justifying that. But, it's like the German chancellor said, Israel is doing our dirty work. The British opposition leader, the Tory leader, Badenoch, said Israel is fighting a proxy war on our behalf. When Western leader after Western official after Western politician says that they genuinely believe that Israel is their proxy, doing the West's dirty work on its behalf, keeping all these people in their place, they're either all making it up or they're onto something.
Eskandar, in his new Left Review Sidecar piece, writes, quote, "A growing chorus of Iranian voices, both political elites and the wider public, is arguing that had Iran taken this step long ago, that step being acquiring nuclear weapons, it would not have ended up in such a precarious situation. North Korea, they observe, better understood the logic of U.S. power and acted accordingly. The prevailing view in these circles is that if Iran still possesses the technical capability, now is the time to use it." My question is, in retrospect, in terms of military strategy, would Iran have been better off had it gone nuclear? And another question along those lines, a huge danger for Iran right now is obviously how deeply Israel has degraded Iran's regional power since October 7th, particularly its spectacular, extraordinarily murderous, but quite successful assaults on Hezbollah and on Lebanese civilians, but also in terms of the role played by Israel in toppling the Assad regime and then wiping out Syria's military capabilities. Given what we know now, would Iran have been better off if it had gone nuclear sooner? And would it have been advantageous for Iran and Hezbollah and the rest of the axis of resistance to have attacked Israel earlier? What do you make of the strategic calculi at play on the part of the axis of resistance? Was playing defense and exercising so much restraint the right decision in terms of military strategy?
It's a very important question, but it's also a very difficult one to answer. North Korea was able to go nuclear, but it did not do so in a context in which you constantly had US presidents and European leaders and South Korea and Japan, to put it in context, saying that they would never allow North Korea to go nuclear and would use whatever means necessary to prevent that. So there's an argument to be made that if Iran had followed this course of action, that this war would have been launched against it much earlier. But having said that, and what many Iranian critics are saying is that, fool me once, shame on me, fool me, or whatever,
Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Yeah. And that Iran should have never trusted the US to fulfill its commitments under the nuclear agreement. But it did, and it certainly, once the US reneged on that commitment and that agreement and repudiated it and renounced it in 2018, that was not the time to show restraint, and that was the time to go nuclear. And what these people are essentially saying is, you have two models in front of you, North Korea and Iraq, and those are the only two options available. And if you don't make a choice will be made for you. That's kind of the criticism. So that's the first aspect of it, concerns whether or not Iran should have gone nuclear. And the reason that I find this a difficult question to answer is because Iran was in a very different situation than North Korea was when it developed its nuclear arsenal. The second one concerns the axis of resistance and the restraint it showed after October 7th, where you had first Hezbollah launching attacks first on Israeli-occupied Lebanese territory, and then when Israel responded on territory within Israel, and then the Houthis, of course, joining, and then militias in Iraq and Syria launching attacks at both Israel and U.S. forces. And here, on the one hand, I feel a compelling argument can be made that if they had gone all in a coordinated fashion at the same time, that they may well have avoided the very severe blows that were administered to them later. But let's not forget that on October 7th, Hamas acted unilaterally. It did not coordinate its attacks with its coalition members in the axis of resistance. In fact, Hamas has always had kind of an ambiguous relationship with the axis of resistance, one foot in and one foot out. And according to US and Israeli intelligence, if I'm not mistaken, Hamas did not even inform Iran and Hezbollah and so on about what was about to conduct. And I think many of these other members of the coalition, they saw what Hamas did and said, okay, Hamas, you acted in your own interest without coordinating with us. Well, don't expect us to now subordinate our national security and so on to your agenda. We're going to respond the same. Okay, we will, do what we can and what we feel is necessary, but we're not going to be dragged into your agenda, just as you didn't coordinate with us. So yes, you can make the particularly in the case of Hezbollah, where I think its late leader Hassan Nasrallah was acting on the basis of a number of motives. He wanted to limit the damage that Israel would be able to inflict on Lebanon. He did not believe that Israel was going to launch a full-scale war on Lebanon, and he believed that he could control the level of escalation, which turned out to be, with hindsight, fatal miscalculations. But one can understand why Hezbollah, which was unprepared for full-scale war on October 7th, did not initiate a full-scale war on October 8th. At the same time, yes, you can make a logical argument that when faced with a irrational genocidal regime like Israel, restraint is never an option.
Is this nonstop murderous Israeli belligerence, is it in some ways a sign of weakness, that Israel is rushing headlong toward overreach, international delegitimation, ultimately maybe even one day downfall? Or, more depressingly, is it a signal that Israel is on the path to establishing the worst form of regional dominance imaginable? Because it can also seem that Israel, much like the right all around the world and here in the United States, that it is, to borrow the words of Ranajit Guha, establishing dominance without hegemony. Looking ahead, do you have any optimism that Israel's pariah status will at some point lead to justice in a free Palestine, or do you fear that we're heading toward the opposite, toward the full liquidation of anti-imperialist struggle and some sort of more permanent triumph of reaction?
Well, we began this discussion by looking at Israel's motivations in launching its war against Iran. And one thing I should have pointed out is that in conducting this attack on what Israel characterizes as the head of the octopus, it is seeking to fundamentally transform the strategic equation of the Middle East. It is looking for what I've called the 1967 moment, where through overwhelming military force, it fundamentally reshapes the entire region for a generation. And I think Israel is genuinely convinced that it is capable of doing so, and that it is in the process of doing so, and that it will succeed in doing so. At the same time, I think if you look at the way Israel has conducted this campaign, we're almost 2 years in, and it has still not identified what it wants to do with the Gaza Strip apart from the mass expulsion of its Palestinian population, which, by the way, if we're now dealing with the US-Iranian war that goes regional, may well happen, and also in the West Bank, while we're focusing on the region going up in flames. But other than that, I think that's not an objective that is going to be achieved. And Israel's approach to all of its problems, and in a sense, it has been so for decades, is that there is no challenge that cannot be overcome by military force. And if the problem is not solved by military force, that's because even more force was required. And it's become an addiction to war. It's now become, I believe, a state and society that cannot exist without war, that is sustained by war, whose raison d'etre has become war and warfare and more war. And that, to me, is an unsustainable path. Yes, things do look horrible and horrific and catastrophic and apocalyptic now. They don't just look that way, they are that way. But this is an absolutely unsustainable path for any state to be on. And it cannot end well for any state that believes that this is the only way to survive.
Well, Mouin Rabbani, thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me.
Mouin Rabbani is a co-editor of Jadaliyya and non-resident senior fellow of the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that, when a great social revolution shall have mastered the results of the bourgeois epoch, the markets of the world and the modern powers of production, and subjected them to the common control of the most advanced peoples, then only will human progress cease to resemble that hideous pagan idol who would not drink the nectar but from the skulls of the slain. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. During the summer, we post them a little less often. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thierry Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram and Blue Sky at The Dig Radio. And please do find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this one. If it's on iTunes or Spotify or wherever, please rate and review us positively. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really does that is you telling people you know, IRL or online, wherever, to check out the pod. Please make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.